Welcome everyone, and my name is Chris Knight. I'm the director of the Open Aerial Imagery Association, and this is our Open Aerial Imagery Multi-Source Interpretation and Analysis Seminar Series.
Well, thanks everyone for being here for this next presentation. The title of this presentation is Detecting Disinformation and Hostile Information Activities in Aerial Imagery and Geospatial Data. Now, when the last time I've given this, or I gave this presentation, there was a question at the end where somebody asked, well, how can I, as a layperson, understand if an image or a graphic is disinformation? And so I'd like to start with that question to say, that's what we're doing today. That's what we'll be talking about today and providing today. I'll be presenting one way to do, so that anybody can use, one method that any person can use to start detecting disinformation and hostile information, or to test whether something might be disinformation or hostile information. You don't have to be a specialist. These really rely on some basic research, tradecraft and methods that are useful for just getting started and being able to do this. So I'll start with an overview of the rest of the presentation. We'll start with definitions. We'll go through sources, so trusted sources, how you can assess different source types, methods for how you can research and how you can start looking at sources of information and assessing them for their truth, for their veracity. Then we'll look at a case study, in this case, MH17, the flight MH17. Then we'll talk a little bit about communication and uncertainty. And I'll make sure to show you the sources that I used to compile this particular presentation. So first, before we get started, it's important to have clear definitions of terms like disinformation and misinformation. So disinformation is misleading information that has the function of misleading someone. That is, it is intentionally misleading information. It is information that is false, created on purpose, knowing that it's false, for the purpose of tricking people. That is different from simple misinformation, which is misleading or mistaken information that is spread without the intent or goal to mislead. It's just wrong information that people think is right, but they're not intentionally trying to trick someone else. And last, an important aspect of this, both disinformation and misinformation, is the idea of uncertainty. And uncertainty here, when it's used in this presentation, means the acknowledgement of incomplete information or knowledge about something. And usually it is used to talk about a psychological state, people feeling uncertain, people feeling unsure. I also want to use it here in a way that reflects on disinformation. Disinformation in particular plays on this idea of uncertainty, plays on the idea that we don't have complete knowledge of almost anything in the world. And that's part of what makes disinformation effective. But it's okay to be uncertain. So we don't want to run away necessarily from uncertainty. It's important to acknowledge it and be transparent about it and then move forward. So those are some definitions for this talk. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about sources. And here I differentiate, I categorize sources in two ways, primary versus secondary. So we're going to start with primary. And in the case of geospatial information, a primary source of information is raw image data in this case. And this type of information in particular is acquired through a closed system of acquisition. So that means when you've got a satellite company like Maxar or ISI that specializes in radar, that company owns its sensors and it uses its sensors to collect information. That company transmits the information, it stores it, and then it distributes it to customers for exploitation. So typically, For example, the graphic on the right shows an image from Planet. Typically Planet and Maxar and Airbus have closed systems of image data acquisition. And when you purchase an image from them, you are the first person outside of that organization to access it typically. And so it's very important for us to understand the process for data acquisition for each organization we engage with. In the case of commercial satellite imagery providers, this closed system of acquisition ensures that the data that we get is probably accurate data that has not been meddled with. And so in the case here, it's not impossible to conceive of, say, a foreign government inserting a somehow false or fake image into a company's data acquisition process, but I've never heard of it, and it would be difficult to do at scale. And so I think for the most part, these raw sources of data, especially satellite image data, tend to be good primary sources of information. That's different from secondary sources of information, where somebody, an organization or an individual, takes that primary data and then adds analysis to it. So this is usually in the form of a finished geospatial intelligence product. The example here is an example from AllSource, where we've taken that image that was shown here, this primary image data source, and we've added information to it. When you look at just the raw image, we might look at it and say, okay, it looks like that could be an airfield or an airport maybe, because those long lines suggest that maybe these are runways or taxiways or aprons for aircraft. But beyond that, it's a little difficult for us to be able to know more about different parts of facilities on this image. For example, it can be a little more difficult to say, assess, oh, this area is an early warning radar area. That takes some specialized knowledge, some work, and then when you call it out, it's an interpretation, it's a judgment call on the part of an organization, looking at that image, exploiting it, and then saying, yep, this is what that is, and then labeling a graphic with it. So all of these labels make this a secondary source of information. When we're assessing secondary sources of information like this, composed graphics like this, we need to assess the reputation of the organizations that produce it. When we're in the audience, we should understand the sources and methods that are used to compile the finished products. When we are the producers of these products, it's very important that organizations communicate clearly how they came to their analysis and what level of certainty they have about each part of the analysis. So now I'm going to, so we've talked about sources. Sources will come up again and later in our case study. But for now, I'd like to focus on some sound research methods for being able to start testing whether something is disinformation or hostile information. So the first is know your source. We will have examples for each of these, but first, know your source. Where is your information coming from? Second, know your metadata. We'll talk about a little bit more about what metadata is with especially satellite imagery information. Know your metadata. Third, observe. So carefully observe, carefully analyze, and then communicate your results to a community. When we can use these tools to assess information, and I'll show you how. So first, a little bit more detail about each one of those. First, know your source. Now, the example graphic here shows raw primary source data, so raw image data. This is a Maxar satellite image. So now we know the source. It came from the Maxar company. We know that Maxar uses a closed system of image data acquisition. That means they collect the image, they transmit that data themselves to their own ground station. I mean, this is a bit of a simplification, but this is generally accurate. They store it themselves, they distribute it for exploitation. Okay, so it's a closed system of image data acquisition. Now, we need to know our metadata. That's the next step. So that means every piece of image data, every piece of geospatial data has information about that data embedded in it. In the case of a satellite image, there are pieces of information attached to every satellite image, telling you where the image is. So there are coordinates. There's a coordinate reference system embedded in each image, so you can get latitude and longitude coordinates from each image. There's a time for when the image was collected, and then there's an image source and sensor in the metadata. There are also, and then, okay, before I get to that, the graphic shows some metadata for this particular image from Maxar. You can see the metadata window here on the left side of the graphic is taken from Maxar, and it's actually a small part of much more metadata that's available, but this gives you an idea that you can get embedded data within each image to give you more information about the image. And it tells you more. It helps to be transparent about the information that you're seeing. You can then use that data to verify, okay, is this actually the time it was collected? Is this actually the location? You can use other kinds of information to verify it. There are also types of, for example, pixel values you can get, even into the level of detail of pixel values for each individual pixel on an image as part of the metadata. And so it can get quite detailed, all of which can be useful if you're going to do certain types of analysis. But that is to say that underscores the importance of knowing your metadata, how to look at it, where to find it, and knowing what the most important parts are. In this case, location and time and image source are the three types of metadata that we're going to pay attention to, very high level types of metadata that will come up later in the presentation. Now, observe, analyze, and communicate. You've got an image here. The first thing to do is to look at different parts of the image. Do these things make sense? Look at different objects. Does it make sense for these objects to be here the way that they are? What are some of these objects? So let's start looking, see different objects. Now, can we start thinking about some relationships between some of the objects? So here, this is an example of vessels in open ocean. The vessel types match the location in general, which we find when we start then digging deeper. We've got our observations. Now we need to start identifying the observations at a higher level of detail, and then start thinking about explanations for why they're there and why they're related to one another. You know, in this case, this is Mischief Reef in the South China Sea. The objects around are vessels. The vessel types are Chinese vessel types. One is Chinese military, other Chinese Coast Guard. Then there are fishing vessels. All of this matches generally with the area that the image was taken from. Then it's important to communicate this information. So when you've got your objects, they're identified, you've got some understanding for explaining why they're there, what some of their relationships are. It's important to clearly express these things, and then to caveat all of your expressions with a level of uncertainty. So for example, if you think that, you know, the fishing vessels here called out on the graphic are probably, you know they're fishing vessels, you think they're probably Chinese, even though there's no other visual piece of information on this image that can show you that they're Chinese. Their proximity to this particular location and other clearly identified Chinese Coast Guard vessels suggest that these are probably Chinese fishing vessels, but you want to highlight that it is most likely that these fishing vessels are Chinese. That's not 100% certain. It's just you think that it's highly likely that they are. Those kinds of expressions of certainty are essential in our communication and all help as methods for helping to overcome and first identify disinformation, but then overcome it. And so you want to search for those types of caveats in geospatial communications that you run into yourself. If you don't see them, that should raise some questions. This type of communication style, clarity, transparency, caveats, all facilitate other organizations and individuals to replicate your findings and or expand on your findings later. So it's very important to get this right. Observe, analyze, and then communicate clearly. So now we'll get to a case study in disinformation and apply some of these research methods to this case study. We're going to look at one case study, one example. We're going to practice or ask the questions. What is the source? What is the metadata? How can we use careful observation analysis? And then what role does transparent communication play in this? And in this case, this will be an example from the organization Bellingcat. Bellingcat is a journalist organization that's a nonprofit organization that is devoted to transparency and to mitigating disinformation and hostile information activities. And they have done a variety of these kinds of case study examples. I'm drawing on their work. Their work uses some of these research verification methods that I'm highlighting here. And so they're a great example to use. And we'll get more into that. But before we dive into the specific case study of flight MH17, it is important to know some background about this incident. So now, the most important background is that this incident involves the Ukraine and Russia, and in particular, Russia's annexation of Crimea, a part of Ukraine, in February 2014. So following a series of political disputes between the Ukraine, the European Union, and Russia in February 2014, Russian military forces took control of Crimea, which was a Russian majority province of Ukraine. Now, during this period of annexation, Russian military forces took control of key air and air defense infrastructure in Crimea. Now, at the time, Russia denied that Russian military was involved at all, but over time, it's clear that this was the case. Now, later in July, there was a crash of an airliner in Ukraine. This is the crash of flight MH17, and this occurred on July 17th, 2014. So on July 17th, 2014, flight MH17 was shot down from an altitude of about 33,000 feet in eastern Ukraine. Now, at the time, this area of eastern Ukraine where this aircraft was shot down was the site of ongoing combat between Ukrainian military forces and Russia-backed military forces. So this is the background. It was established fairly early on that the flight was shot down from a high altitude because of the debris field, which stretched for many miles, which would not have been the case had it dropped from the air and crashed into the ground. So immediately after this happened, the question was, who was responsible for shooting down flight MH17? Ukraine blamed Russia and requested the United States and the EU to pressure Russia. Russia blamed Ukraine. At first, as part of their general campaign of denying any military involvement in Ukraine, but then specifically denying involvement in this particular incident. So just to set the stage, this situation was ripe for disinformation campaigning. You've got a dispute, you've got interests on both sides blaming the other for a high-profile incident. So this was ripe for a state to come in and create disinformation campaigns about this. So given this situation, Russia had an interest in particular in trying to deflect any kind of attention for responsibility of this event. And relatively soon after this event, the Russian Ministry of Defense published graphics suggesting Ukrainian air defenses shot down MH17. And this was published on July 21st, 2014. Now, here is an overview of this from the organization Bellingcat. They did a full case study of this publication, this example publication. The Russian Ministry of Defense published a series of graphics, 5 total graphics, and Bellingcat looked at each graphic and did an analysis of each one. The overall method that Bellingcat used to do their work here is very similar to the method that I'm presenting to you today. First, they looked at sources. Where did this come from? So these publications came from the Russian Ministry of Defense website. So the Russian Ministry of Defense published this. It was from the Russian state. Then they looked at each graphic. First, before we even do that, it's important to know, as soon as you see this graphic, you see that it is a graphic and not raw image data. So Russia did not publish a raw image that then organizations could then look at. They published a graphic where humans came in and put labels on it and arranged things in a particular way. So that doesn't mean that it's necessarily false automatically. It means we need to look at it with the understanding that this was a human-created graphic. Next, Bellingcat did a metadata analysis of the graphic. So they looked at each graphic. They looked at the file type, for example, the height, the width of the image, and all different other kind, when it was created, the platform, the software that was used to create it, etc. Then Bellingcat went one step further with these graphics, where they did what they call an error level analysis. They looked at compression rates within the graphics to see if they differed, and if so, by how much. And the idea is a relatively high compression rate in a graphic suggests that something has been added to it, and a relatively low compression rate that it has not been tampered with. Now, when a graphic's been altered, it could be the addition of a label that could increase compression rate. But it could also be something else. And so what they found in their error level analysis, in particular with respect to two of the 5 graphics, is that there were widely varying compression rates across the graphic that were not consistent with just adding labels, suggesting that parts of the graphics were manipulated visually and not in a transparent way to an audience. Okay, so that's an example. This is a high-level overview. This was a very detailed study that Bellingcat did, and we've got the source for this if you'd like to look at it. I'm sure you can also just Google some of these key terms and find this particular source. So if you're interested in more detail about this and how they did it, go ahead and go to that source. But we don't need to do necessarily error level analysis in order to get pretty far along the way to identifying disinformation examples when we see them. And here's an example of that. Now, this is a second example of disinformation associated with the same event. So later in November, Russian state media broadcasted a graphic showing or purporting to show MH17 being attacked by a fighter jet. Now, we're going to use our research verification methods here, knowing our source, knowing our metadata, observation, analysis, and communication to do an assessment of this example. So it's important to point out that this example story is much different than the first story that was published by the Russian state, suggesting, the first story, if you remember, suggested that Ukrainian air defense may have shot down the jet. Well, this suggests a fighter jet shot down the jet. Now, shot down the passenger airliner. Now, these are not consistent, but that's not the point. The point of disinformation campaigns in general, especially this one, is to put out a lot of possible explanations to confuse the issue and to raise suspicion and to raise ideas that there could be a variety of answers. It's to make sure, it's to increase the level of uncertainty in an audience, to say, well, we're not sure, could have been so many different things. Some people, some organizations refer to this technique as flooding the zone, meaning you just put as much information or disinformation as possible into the public sphere in the hopes of muddying the issue. And so here's the second example of the same event is a very different kind of explanation. Now, when we first look at this graphic here, we should see one thing stand out first. Now, the first thing is, this is not raw image data. This is a graphic. This is something that there are these black boxes, call out, and a zoom in area here. And this is something that is not present in raw image data. As soon as you see these types of things, this is a graphic that's created by somebody. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically false. It's just important to know visually, we can immediately see here in this case, this is a graphic, this is a secondary source, not a primary data source. So that's an important first step to take. Now, secondly, before we get more into knowing your source, from an imagery analysis perspective, it's important to note a couple of things further about just this image here. First, any image, as mentioned earlier in the previous presentation, it bears mentioning here now again, one image is taken as 1 second in time. So it is a representation of 1 second in time of something happening on the Earth. So that's quite fleeting. The idea that an image would capture a fighter jet shooting something is incredible. That would be extremely coincidental. First of all, you can't, it would be extraordinarily difficult to plan for something like that. And even more coincidental to catch something like that without planning. So that's the first thing. But let's follow that a little further. To catch on an image 1 second in time, a fighter jet shooting something at another aircraft that's also on the image, that would be even more coincidental and difficult to do. Then, one step further, the idea that this aircraft that is being fired at is not just any passenger airliner, but MH17, the one that is in the news, would be really incredibly coincidental, straining any kind of credibility. So just that's one deductive way of thinking about what's the likelihood that this is accurate in this particular case. So that's one thing to consider. We've got a secondary source graphic, and the event that's being captured is highly unlikely to have been captured by an image. Not necessarily impossible, but extraordinarily unlikely. So now let's go through our methods. Know your source. In this case, the Russian state media published this graphic. It is a graphic, not a raw image. And Bellingcat pointed out that there was actually contradictory original sourcing about where this graphic came from. When Russian state media published it, they claimed somebody emailed it to them. But in fact, Bellingcat found that this graphic was posted 1 month earlier on a Russian message board. So there's dispute about what the source of this graphic was in the first place. So already we've got a lot of warning signs about this. Now, know your metadata. And here it's important to consider just our general sources of metadata. Let's just look at location as metadata. When Bellingcat took this image and georeferenced it, put it into Google Earth, and then compared that to location data for the actual flight MH17, they found that it varied by some distance. And so that variance was a way of showing location data presented in the graphic didn't match known location data for the original flight plan and for the original flight data. And so that variation raises more questions about this graphic's veracity. Then Bellingcat went further and looked at timing and image sources, and they found that the images themselves were created from different image sources as composites. And by comparing timing, so looking at the timing, for example, in a free source of imagery, in this case, Google Earth, they were able to find that the background image was taken directly from Google Earth, and the zoom-in image was taken from a Russian geospatial data provider. So like a Russian Google Maps. Yandex Maps is the name of that. So just by looking at location, timing, and different freely available image sources, Bellingcat was able to put together more examples of how this was not consistent. Bellingcat went further then. They did careful observation. They looked at MH17 is a Malaysia airline flight. And so they looked at Malaysia airline aircraft, and they found that the name of the aircraft company, or in this Malaysia, the name Malaysia is located in a particular place on the fuselage of the aircraft, typically over the wing or towards the rear of the aircraft. Yet when they looked at the image example, they found that on the fuselage of the aircraft on the image, the passenger aircraft on the image, that there's a slightly gray area here in front of the wings, suggesting that this was the name of a different aircraft company. So not definitive by itself, but an important, careful observation about something else that raises a question about this image. But then they went further. They did some deeper analysis. So they found, they did some searching in Russian and did some Google searching using Russian terms, looking for different images, image source search. And they played around with different terms, to use the term Boeing top view in Russian, and found as one of their first image choices an aircraft, a Boeing aircraft that looked quite similar to the aircraft that was used in the graphic. And then finally, Bellingcat clearly communicated their findings. So they published this on their website as an example of disinformation. The hope is to mitigate disinformation and misinformation about this event and to reduce uncertainty about it. So this clear communication saying, here's what we did, here are all of our sources, here's what we found. By being able to do that, this transparent communication allows other people, other organizations, other individuals, including myself in this case, to replicate their results, say, yep, this is consistent, and then that in turn builds trust in a community of people that share those norm communication, And so the communication aspect is quite important after this entire work that you do. Say, this is what we found, and this is how we did it. This is basic tradecraft. It's also basic scientific method to do your work and then communicate your results openly for peer review and assessment. So now I'll finish with one other example that has come up in the past and is included here now. Another example is China's internment camps in Xinjiang. So in this case, China has its own mapping service of Baidu Maps. So it's like Google Maps for China. It's called Baidu. It's their company. It's an indigenous company. And the Chinese government controls aspects of this source of information. And in this case, a media organization, BuzzFeed News, found that Baidu Maps, China's indigenous mapping service, was taking tiles out of certain areas of image tiles out of locations in Xinjiang. And in fact, when BuzzFeed first started, they said, well, wait a second, when we're looking through Xinjiang at Baidu Maps, we're finding all these image gaps. And so they didn't know why there were image gaps at first. It was taking other information they had and comparing it to where these gaps were that they found, wait a minute, it looks like several of these gaps are over internment camps that we've identified, where Muslim Uyghur populations in Xinjiang are being directed and forcibly interned for long periods against their will, internment camps. So this suggests that these tiles are not accidental, but that they're intentionally put there for some reason, perhaps to obfuscate, perhaps to hide the fact that there are these camps there. Then they tested it. They then developed a simple program to look at the whole area in Xinjiang for all image gaps in Baidu Map in Xinjiang. And then they used the results of that analysis to search for additional camps. And they found many dozens more camps based on searching for these blank tiles in Baidu Maps in Xinjiang. So this is an example first of a country, national level, that engage, in this case, I think, in censorship of their own geospatial data. I would say that that censorship is part of broader disinformation that the Chinese state engages in with regard to its internment camps in Xinjiang. But this particular example is probably better characterized as simple censorship. But then that censorship itself can be used as a research method to actually find more of what China wants to keep out of the public sphere. So it's a great example of, using good sound research methods and lots of different geospatial information in a composite way. So putting it together in a way to find more data. So using censorship to the benefit of finding more of these internment camps. Now, I bring this full circle around to the OpenStreetMap example in the beginning of our presentations today to say, we need organizations like OpenStreetMap and OpenStreetMap in particular to be developing new sources of freely available geospatial data. That's not always the case in the world. From a national perspective, certain states have their own interests and they're developing their own geospatial data sets that are first walled off from other access and at times meddled with, so that it's not just freely available, maybe censored in some ways. And so it's really important to be able to know all the different types of information that we have access to, and then use all these different types in the best way that we can to put together a full picture. Because sometimes things are open and sometimes they're not. And we need to be able to confront both situations and work in both situations. So last, I'll just finish with a sources slide. These slides will be made available to OAIA, to Chris, so that people can have them themselves. But this is an example. First is Disinformation. This is a literature review of sources that define and describe disinformation, the evolution of the term, and how it's defined according to best practices now. Then examples from Bellingcat organization that I talked about. Here are the sources of that. Here's the BuzzFeed News article source. And for the Crimea overview, which was oversimplified for absolutely, but just for background information for the flight MH17 case study, I used Britannica.com and BritishBroadcastingCompany.com to get some background information on the conflict in Crimea in 2014 as part of this presentation. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take any questions from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Renny. That's really great. And what strikes me about this methodology that you've shared with us is it's not highly technical, if you will. It one thought I had was, is there some sort of programmatic way or some sort of technology that I can apply to imagery in order to detect fakes or dupes or anything like that? And there may well be those sorts of techniques, compression analysis and whatnot. But what really strikes me about this approach is it's, like you say, something that any of us can apply. Know our source, know our metadata. Think about the what we're looking at and what that means, and then communicate our reservations and thoughts and conclusions in a way that really express what we've found is a fairly simple approach, and it's really the best way that we can, you know, detect what's going on and come to some sort of certainty. That's really really striking to me, and I thank you for sharing that methodology with us.
Thank you for the comment, Chris, and I'd like to just underscore that, because I think it's important. Sometimes when I think about geospatial data, it sounds really technical, and it sounds like you have to be an expert to even start dealing with it. But some of the best geospatial information is visual, and you don't, nobody needs to be an expert in any one area to be able to ask good questions about sources and to practice some basic critical thinking skills of, you know, what's my source? You know, where did it come from? What's some more detail about that source? That's metadata. And then what are some observations, analysis? How can I compare this information to other kinds of information? It's good, sound research methodology, I think. And so, you know, it's something that actually provides some of the best work that we've done at AllSource, is sound research that doesn't rely on technical knowledge of the data, but rather just good sound research and communication, team communication, you know, conversation with yourself, conversation with others, and then publishing. So I'm so happy and thankful that OAIA has developed this set of presentations, because this is a great example of communication on these issues that helps to spread the word that any of us can start being citizen scientists in this area, in this you know, area of disinformation, to start asking the right questions and then communicating with each other about what we're finding.
A couple of comments in the chat. Fiona mentioned that it's a great technique to Google the image and see if it shows up somewhere else using image search. Yeah, that's a great way of detecting you know, what its origin might have been. And that Bellingcat example of the Russian language search terms giving that overhead Boeing view is quite a clever bit of research, I thought. Ian mentions that what concerns him is, you know, the flooding of misinformation still has an effect, even if it's identified as such. And Emily responded, mentioning that it takes a lot of time and resources to play whack-a-mole with spamming of disinformation. And, you know, I personally agree that that's a real concern with respect to this. One thing that struck me in that NATO video, that short excerpt we saw from NATO is sometimes ignoring it is the best approach. You know, once you identify it as misinformation, you know, ignore it. But it's a good observation that sometimes you can't, or sometimes that might end up filling up the bulk of the conversation. You know, any comments on that, Renny, about how can we deal with, you know, mass volumes of misinformation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's no easy answer. And you know what, I think ignoring it, I thought also of that NATO presentation, ignoring misinformation and disinformation when it's identified as such. The work that Bellingcat does takes some of the heavy lift off of some of these issues. They can't do everything, but they're a great organization that has taken it upon themselves to get the right funding and expertise to engage in some of these issues and develop clear case study examples. Once we've identified, in this particular example, a nation state as engaging in disinformation activities, over time it becomes easier to say, to question any information that comes from that source. Also, once you get organizations that develop trusted methods for engaging with it and showing that information is false, like Bellingcat, they become more trusted, and you can more easily just look at some of their feedback and more easily go. You don't have to question every single thing that they do and replicate it. You can start trusting organizations like that. And so I think trust for data sources can be sometimes difficult to find and generate, but once you do, that becomes the shorthand for us to begin operating in a clearer media environment. So develop your trusted sources and then rely on them, and don't make yourself go and chase down everything. That's where I start. For AllSource, we don't look at all information and do it. We're driven by certain company needs, and so that points us in a particular direction that's different from Bellingcat, for example. So as an organization, we don't feel the need to do all that work, but we're aware of it, and we develop our own list of trusted organizations and individuals as shortcuts to use in cases like this.
Thanks, Renny. Now, everyone, while we have Renny here, last chance for any questions that you might want to put directly to him. Feel free to jump on or put something else into the chat. Renny, thank you very much for the presentations and the entire seminar series. It was really, really informative. I quite enjoyed it all, and I really look forward to seeing other stuff that you and AllSource put out as well. Is there, if anybody's interested, are there any mailing lists or anything that the attendees here today can do to keep in touch with AllSource?
Absolutely. I would point people to just first our website to start engaging with us if you're interested in joining our network. We've got a distributed network of experts, and we welcome applications for people to join. We're a task-based organization, and so what that means is we develop a distributed network of experts, and then we engage our experts when there is a project to engage them, and when not, we all interact on Slack and do our own work. We provide resources for our analysts to do some of their own research, and so we welcome people joining that. So I'd point people to our website, and if you're interested in our mailing list, you can sign up for our Spotlight program. Our Spotlight program is a weekly group of, a weekly one graphic overview of an issue that one of our analysts has been studying anywhere in the world. And so that's another way to just get regular updates from us about what we're doing and some of the things that we're engaged in. So I'll follow up with some links for those.
Great. Thanks, Renny. And yeah, I think I'm on a couple of those mailing lists, and I do like the weekly Spotlight. It's always an interesting topic. I quite enjoy receiving those in my inbox. With that, then, I will move on to our concluding remarks and the little bit of an experiment that I'm hoping that you'll all be able to help me with. First, here's a quick slide with some contact information and interesting or email addresses that you can reach the various organizations. So AllSource Analysis, their website's there, general email address, you need to get a hold of them, but go to their website and check out for their mailing lists and other information. Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, their website, you can link to their platform, get involved in their tasks and their individual projects that they're working on. Also a generic email address. In the information that I circulate after this event in a week or so, you'll get an email in your inbox, and it'll contain a place where you can get the links to all of the slide materials and direct contact information for the individuals and so on and so forth. Look there, but in the meantime, here is some information on those two organizations. NATO engagement, do check out the Facebook group that they've set up for their NATO engagement project, and join in the discussion there if you can. As well, in the last email that you received from us in relation to this seminar series, there's a survey link from NATO. I really encourage everybody to click on that and answer their questions. That helps them understand who is receiving this type of information, what they've learned, and how they can better direct and channel their efforts in the future. And then finally, Open Aerial Imagery Association. There's our website, and that contact email address will go directly to me if you need to get a hold of me. And please feel free to ask any questions or join.